That prelude theme to Final Fantasy VII, no matter how many years it's been or how long it's been between listens, it always makes me that tiny little bit sad. And it's only one of the many reasons that Final Fantasy VII, along with Final Fantasy VI, is at the top of the list when it comes to all-time greatest Final Fantasy games, at least in my opinion. Final Fantasy VII had incredible characters, both from a story and a design perspective. It has some of the best music in an RPG ever, and tunes that hold up incredibly well to this day. And at the time of its release, its graphics were unprecedented and damn near unimaginable. And the story has remained within the hearts of millions of people all the way from childhood to adulthood. And Final Fantasy VII was a cultural phenomenon for its time. And it ushered in one of the great golden ages of RPGs because everyone wanted to cash in on the success that Final Fantasy VII was enjoying. And as always, this video is full of spoilers, just like every tribute review I do on this channel. So having said that, this is my tribute review for Final Fantasy VII. Let's start with the visuals of Final Fantasy VII. The leap forward in graphics for Final Fantasy VII can't be understated. Going from 16-bit graphics to full polygon accompanied with full motion videos was mind-breaking. I was like, 13 to 14 when it was released, and I was immersed in a world like I hadn't ever been before. Towns were now in 3D with almost a diorama feel to them, giving the world a sense of life and realization that myself and millions of other people had never experienced. Seeing the Highwind for the first time and getting to interact with 3D environments in ways gamers hadn't had the chance to before are just a couple of examples of how immersive the 3D graphics could be. And we haven't even talked about how good the battles looked yet. Characters looked fully realized when combat was initiated, and attack animations were often accompanied by dynamic camera work as well, giving battles a cinematic feel to them for the first time. And then there were limit breaks and the summons. By God, the summons were absolutely unreal. And even if I had the ability to skip them at the time, I never would have because they were such a visual feast. And to this day are still incredible to watch. Some of the best ever made. I was so obsessed with the summons when I first played this game, I would keep even the weakest of them equipped to my characters at all times, which truly messed up my material loadout, and looking back, I had no idea how to use the materia system properly as a kid. And the battles were accompanied by some of the best music the Final Fantasy series has ever done. Of particular note, the main boss theme, one of the greatest boss themes ever. So you know what? Let's celebrate how badass the limit breaks and summons looked in this game with a quick little battle montage. Battle animations in Final Fantasy VII, to this day, I just have a big smile on my face whenever I get to watch them because they're just honestly so good. And I gotta give a shout out to Knights of the Round. This is my favorite summon of all time in the entirety of the Final Fantasy franchise. When I saw it for the first time, I was in awe of the amount of damage it could do, how cool the knights looked, and it was a more than fitting reward for the Chocobo minigame. It made it absolutely worth doing. Just such a cool ability. But as cool as the battles look, I do want to talk about how important and incredible Final Fantasy VII setting was, because it is easily one of its most beloved and enduring qualities. So let's talk Midgar. Final Fantasy VII made Midgar feel like a sprawling metropolis unknown before in terms of scale for a video game. And in terms of visuals, it was awesome to behold. And we only got to visit a handful of sectors, and all of those being in the game's slums, never above plate. And that aided in making the city feel vast. Your imagination left to do the rest, even though I would have loved to have seen more. And Midgar was just the tip of the iceberg. We eventually get to go see the rest of the world with iconic locations such as Cosmo Canyon, Junon, Nibelheim, and more. From the game's setting, to its battles, to its overworld map, to its full motion videos, in terms of visual effects, this game was in a class all its own. And for gameplay, even though a lot changed in Final Fantasy VII, a lot stayed the same as well, especially in regards to turn-based battles. But they still had some new bells and whistles, such as limit breaks and new command materia. Honestly, I found the battle system so engaging that I didn't even really notice the reduced party size. Since we went from 5 to 4 to now 3 characters in battle for the Final Fantasy series. But something Final Fantasy VII did in comparison to other Final Fantasy games was take the minigame dial and crank it to friggin' 11. Going to the Gold Saucer for the first time and seeing its vastness in FMV style, and then going to play the endless amount of minigames, submarine battles, snowboarding, basketball, the Coliseum, chocobo racing, and more. As a kid, I sunk countless hours into Final Fantasy VII's vast array of minigames. But speaking of the minigames, while a lot of Final Fantasy VII has aged quite well in my opinion, the minigames is one of those things that really hasn't. Snowboarding, for example, holy crap, I could barely control myself. I was just like, wow, how the heck was I ever good at this as a kid? And the chocobo racing minigame, I skipped it completely this time. To get Knights of the Round, I just beat Emerald Weapon instead. I just had no patience for the chocobo minigame. I played it a crap ton when I was a kid, did it multiple times over multiple playthroughs in order to get Knights of the Round, because there was no way I was going to beat Emerald or Ruby Weapon with the way I was loading up my materia. And it's just, just the racing itself, I didn't find very fun. The convoluted way of, raising chocobos properly. The mini games just weren't doing it for me this time. As a kid, they were great, but nowadays I was just like, eh. So it's one of the things I just didn't do a lot of in, my most recent playthrough. And speaking of Emerald Weapon, the introduction of both it and Ruby Weapon, the game's super bosses, was a new experience for me at the time as well when I was a kid. The original releases of Final Fantasy 2 and 3, 4 and 6 didn't really have super bosses, and if they did, they definitely weren't on the level of Ruby and Emerald. I sunk hours as a kid into trying to defeat them, but I just couldn't do it because, as I mentioned, I didn't know how to load out my materia properly. But it was a welcome addition for those who truly wanted to master the game. But going through the game again all these years later, and knowing how to properly manipulate the materia system, by God, can you create some overpowered characters. Holy crap. I was absolutely stomping through everything in my way towards, the middle to late half of the game. But it was still fun because it's I actually know how to use the materia system properly now, or at least manipulate it well. And it was still fun going through the game and just stomping these enemies, especially given how some of them really gave me a hard time as a kid. And as a lot of RPGs were at the time, Final Fantasy VII, was quite a linear experience. But as I've said many times on this channel, a linear experience or linear design is almost necessary in order to tell, a cohesive, coherent, well-paced story. But the game does open up quite a bit, towards, the later third or second half of the game when you get the high wind and you're able to traverse the world and tackle a lot of the game's side quests. So there is some open worldness to the game, not as much as I would say, maybe Final Fantasy VI, but it is there. And it's a part of the game I would always enjoy coming to among subsequent playthroughs. I always liked getting that little bit of freedom after having a very linear experience for a good part of the game. Now let's get to the really good stuff, the game's characters and story, because by and large, this is the reason why I love RPG so much, and it holds especially true for this game. And you're gonna have to indulge me a little bit here because there are so many aspects of Final Fantasy VII in terms of characters and story I want to cover. And they totally deserve to be, because it is what makes this game great, more so than anything else I've mentioned so far. I want to talk about Shinra first. Shinra is a world power in this game. Not only is it a world power, it is the world power. For all intents and purposes, it has conquered the world already by the time the game has started. Every nation has either been brought to heel, and any resistance there is to Shinra's rule is, scattered and uncoordinated. Shinra was and is an amazing antagonistic organization. Instead of an empire to fight, we now have an evil corporate organization. A first for the Final Fantasy series, and a first for me, at least, in terms of RPGs in general. Shinra had within its organization a ton of different actors, so let's cover them in order to better understand how they were so important to making Final Fantasy VII a success. Shinra had in its possession the alien calamity Genova, a parasitic organism from space that could infect other organisms with its genetic material, either mutating them horribly or taking control of their minds to do its bidding. Genova gave the game a unique horror flavor that I haven't felt in a Final Fantasy game since. Yes, others have attempted it to varying degrees, but none have captured that unique monster magic that Genova had. And Shinra also fostered Sephiroth, one of Final Fantasy's most popular and enduring villains. He was the most elite member of the already elite soldier organization. And this game did an excellent job illustrating how far beyond Sephiroth was to your party in terms of strength, such as when we leave Midgar and we try to cross the swamp to the Mithril Mines and we encounter the Midgar Zolom, which totally wipes the floor with our party. But when we're able to sneak across it on that chocobo, we come across one impaled on a goddamn tree, illustrating that there is quite a large gap to overcome between you and the game's main antagonist. And the thing that makes Sephiroth compelling is he is a tragic character as well, because he is not a monster right out of the gate. He goes crazy after learning the truth of his upbringing, and unfortunately he is the byproduct of misunderstanding to a degree as well. By and large, it seems like he thinks his mother is technically Genova, that he wasn't born from a woman, that he isn't actually human. Yes, it is fucked up that he has these cells and that he's been lied to his whole life and he's been used his whole life by Shinra. So, it was bound to come to a head eventually. So, I found Sephiroth very compelling for a lot of reasons, because he unfortunately is just, the product of his environment by and large. I'm sure obviously having Genova cells in him since he was a baby is obviously going to f up his nature as well. But, he's a victim of Shinra just as much as anyone else is. And it's his tragic circumstances combined with his overwhelming and menacing presence that make him one of the all-time greatest villains. So we have Shinra, possessing both Genova and Sephiroth at one point. Then they also have, Professor Hojo, the, mad scientist you just love to hate in this game. And then we also have President Rufus, the son of President Shinra, the badass kind of new kid on the block. And then we also have the Turks, some of the most beloved Final Fantasy villains of all time. Very much almost kind of like anti-heroes as well. And they always are accompanied by their own badass theme. No matter how many times I hear it, that Turk theme is pretty damn slick. I think it's safe to say that the antagonists of Final Fantasy VII, contain within it some of the most beloved and hated antagonists ever in the entire RPG genre to this day. And then aside from the game's antagonists, you have the main characters themselves. Final Fantasy VII's main cast is iconic. Its characters are well designed, full of personality, and incredibly sympathetic. First, we have Cloud, the first-class ex-soldier with the iconic sword and just as iconic spiky blonde hair, and I think he has been consistently rated the #1 fan favorite Final Fantasy protagonist for many years. Then we have Tifa, the absolutely incredible, most badass bartender I've ever seen. You know, a renowned martial artist with a heart of gold, essentially, you know, the girl next door, but who can kick ass. And we also have Barrett, the trash-talking leader of Avalanche, you know, who has a gun for an arm. And he is a very loving and doting father as well, fighting to make the world a better place for his daughter. It was very nice having a father in the party to give the game's main conflict more nuance. And then we have, you know, Aerith, you know, our tragic heroine, the last living Cetra, and, you know, for a lot of the game, the main romantic interest, as well as just a genuinely sweet person that you can't help but cheer for. Then we have Red 13 from Cosmo Canyon, the very mysterious, you know, essentially a dog that can talk. And oh my God, what an intro sequence he has too when he's with Aerith in that container in the Shinra building. And it's implied that Hojo wants to like force them to mate or whatever. Man, this game was disturbing in some ways, and I'm not surprised that didn't make it into the remake. And then we have, and in my opinion, the best rendition of Cid Final Fantasy has ever done, Cid Highwind, the absolute most potty mouth curmudgeon I've ever seen in a video game. Love him to death. And then we have Kate Sith, you know, the mascot character, and very much the Shinra executive Reeve in disguise, or being remotely controlled by him anyway. And then we have two completely missable characters. We have Yuffie, the ninja from Wutai, who's obsessed with collecting materia, and then we have Vincent, you know, badass guy found in a coffin. And the thing that makes him super compelling to a lot of people is he's a former Turk. And even though Yuffie and Vincent are missable characters, they do provide some interesting backstory and lore to the world of Final Fantasy VII. In Yuffie's case, her being obviously from Wutai, and the fact that Wutai was the last major nation to resist Shinra, and how it has essentially been relegated from at least, you know, being a somewhat decent power in the world to, you know, a backwater tourist attraction. And she very much wants Wutai to, you know, reclaim its place in the world. And this has been greatly expanded upon in compilation content in Final Fantasy VII. And it's something I've always been interested about after learning about it. I'm like, oh man, this is a country Shinra was at war with and, you know, went toe to toe with them. You know, always found that very fascinating. And then we have Vincent, you know, obviously the former Turk, but, you know, he's much more than that. He was, at least it was implied to be, you know, a love interest, or at least a very good friend of Sephiroth's real mother. And unfortunately, you know, she ended up getting with Hojo instead. And, you know, and obviously Vincent confronting Hojo about the Genova experiments, gets shot, and Hojo experiments upon him, essentially making him immortal and modifying his body. And, you know, this comes to a head when we return to Midgar and we parachute in and we go to the Sister A Cannon. And there's very rewarding dialogue between Vincent and Hojo in their final confrontation, with Vincent realizing he shouldn't have been the one napping all his years. It should have been f***ing Hojo. And I love the fact that if you bring Vincent with you, you are rewarded with this type of scene. It just satisfyingly closes the book on another one of the game's conflicts, and it makes you feel like Vincent actually got some resolution in the game. And even though it was a missable moment, it was still a highlight for me to experience. And something I really noticed this time, you know, playing Final Fantasy VII, is just all the swearing in the game, you know, particularly from Barrett, and even to a greater extent Cid. So in Final Fantasy VII, and I'm sure a lot of you remember this, when people swear, you know, in the dialogue box, you know, it shows up as exclamation point, $, pound key, like whatever. But, you know, that doesn't really work on adults, because every time they would swear and all those symbols would pop up, I would be inputting the most, you know, obscene cuss words I could into that dialogue and try to make it, you know, as fitting as possible. And I was just busting out laughing all the time when that was going on. You know, as a kid, it protected me to a degree, but God, not as an adult, not one bit. Especially when you like go into Cid's house for the first time after meeting him in Rocket Town, and he's like, you know, he sits at the table and he puts his feet up and he starts cussing and he's like, drink your goddamn tea. Oh man, I just found that so funny, because if I tried that shit with company in the house, and I know, He's not married at this point, and he's got a very complicated relationship with his lady. But if I sat at the table and lighted up a cigarette or a cigar and started swearing, or just had my feet up on the table in general, my wife would come over and drag me away by the damn ear. So maybe that's why it just tickled me the right way. And even though it was censored cussing, it was again something wholly unique to Final Fantasy VII, and was one of those aspects that I always found personally endearing, because people do swear, particularly in stressful situations, so I found it added a sense of realism to the game for me. And if the swearing wasn't fun enough, Final Fantasy VII is chock full of humor. There's that one scene at the very beginning of the game when you're, on the train to Sector 5 and the alarm's going off and you're forced to run through the train as quickly as possible. If you stop and talk to some people, there's a couple of people sitting on the benches that are completely naked because they've been robbed by underwear bandits. I saw that and I was like, where was that in the remake? I always appreciate being given a good laugh between dramatic story beats, and it only helps in making the main characters more endearing. And this humor was something common in older Final Fantasy games that was lost over time, and it's something I really miss. Another perfect example of some of this game's humor is, you probably know where I'm going with this, is, the Don Corneo scene after you finish the infamous cross-dressing minigame. And you have Tifa, Aerith, and Cloud all threatening to either crush, smash, or essentially rip his balls off if he didn't give up the information they wanted. Just awesome stuff. Not only was this humor nice to have, it was also necessary in order to maintain a delicate balance in this game's overall mood. For there was a ton of tragedy the humor needed to offset. The game was full of tragedy for much of the main cast, and the game also did a really good job in making you care about all the main characters and their well-being. That, and also really hate Shinra because they were responsible for the lion's share of it. And the fact that Shinra was largely responsible for everyone's tragedy to varying degrees made them more iconic as the years have gone on, and made you as the player incredibly invested in ensuring their downfall. So let's go over just how badly Shinra screwed over most of the main cast. So first we have Barret. So they destroy his hometown of Coral, completely burn it to the ground. So they kill his wife. They kill his best friend's wife. They shoot off essentially Barret's arm and his best buddy's arm. And they, emotionally cripple dying Barret's best friend so badly that he goes crazy and essentially kills himself after a confrontation with Barret, telling him to take care of Marlene, who Barret found alive. So Barret's got a really good reason to hate him. No wonder Barret is so pissed off usually. And this revelation of tragic events was just heartbreaking to watch. Seeing just how much pain and suffering he was caused made Barret much more engaging to watch, and made me want to use him often in any confrontation with Shinra. I love it when a game can make me hate the antagonists with every fiber of my being. Then we have Cloud and Tifa themselves. So, they destroy Cloud and Tifa's hometown of Nibelheim, and everyone that Sephiroth didn't kill, Hojo experimented upon and made them, pawns for the reunion, and essentially they would all die eventually as well. Tifa's dad is killed by Sephiroth, and the bond through tragedy that Cloud and Tifa go through together makes their relationship more interesting and dynamic due to the shared trauma they have. Looking at it now, they are obviously able to help each other heal due to their shared experiences. And then there's Aerith. Her backstory is just as awful as anyone else, with both her and her mother being experimented on by Shinra, with her mother dying shortly after escaping, and her father being killed by Hojo shortly after she is born, as her father tries to protect her and her mother from Shinra. Shinra is just bad news all around in this game, and they deserve all the hate they get. And I almost forgot to mention Zack. Even though he is, very much a smaller part of the story, he has a significant part to the story. And the scenes that we do get with him, we think, oh man, Zack, he looks like a cool guy. Like he looks like really awesome, like almost as cool as Cloud, if not cooler. And then, he does his best to save Cloud's life. And they get to Midgard, that, so close but so far away, and he's gunned down, right before the city as it starts to rain. And it just solidifies our hate for Shinra if we didn't hate them enough already. And with Zack, I found this to be one of the saddest moments in the whole game. And we see him for all of a handful of minutes. Just excellent work by Squaresoft, making us care even about characters with an extremely limited amount of screen time. Honestly, this game gives you very little chance to forget how awful Shinra is, because they are constantly throwing new tragedy and trauma caused by them in your face on a regular basis. But it is well paced and never comes on too strong at once. And even though this one wasn't caused by Shinra, it's worth mentioning anyway, and that's Red 13's tragedy. Growing up, believing that his father was a coward that abandoned him and his mother. And, it turns out his father, sacrificed himself, to save the whole of Cosmo Canyon. And that scene that happens when the music starts playing and, his petrified father, Seto, sheds a tear. It's not Shinra that's the cause of it, but it's just another tragedy in this game. And they make us care about the characters beautifully. And we can't have a conversation about Final Fantasy VII's tragedies without talking about the granddaddy of them all, Aerith's death. And it deserves to be talked about because it caused millions of tears to be shed all over the world and is the most iconic death scene in all of Final Fantasy. But before I talk about her death scene, I just need to give a shout out to the City of the Ancients and the theme that plays when you're exploring that city from the forgotten past is one of the most haunting and well done themes I've ever heard. The theme for the City of the Ancients is the perfect setup for the tragedy that is about to occur there. So all these years later, how did Aerith's death affect me? Did it affect me just as much? Well, unfortunately, the answer is yes. Aerith's death sucked. Watching it all these years later, and even knowing what happens, the music, the sense of foreboding, the full motion video they used or created when she actually was killed, the shocked expression on her face before she slowly closed her eyes, and then the white materia falling from her hair, hitting the ground, and then that music starts playing. This is not aided by the fact that, preceding her death, her and Cloud's last encounter was a violent one. In the Temple of the Ancients, after the black materia appears, it appears like Cloud almost, strikes her and knocks her down and is on top of her, beating her, right? It's really hard to tell, just based off the graphics, but it wasn't a great final few moments together anyway. And then on top of that, when he actually does encounter her in the City of the Ancients, he's being controlled by Sephiroth, and he almost, cuts her in two. So, that just makes the tragedy more profound, that their last moments together were, of violence. And not only is it really sad to watch Cloud lay her to rest in that lake, it's also really damn sad seeing everyone else's reaction to her death, especially Tifa and Yuffie's reaction. Tifa kneels down beside her, kind of brushes her hair aside and runs away crying. And then Yuffie, being only, I think she's 16, she just balls in Cloud's arms, before running off. So it's just, heartbreak all around, and it still got me all these years later. And as sad as it was to see her go, it was the sadness of the main cast at her passing that really got me down this time. I could feel their grief. And that is just another testament to how well Final Fantasy VII deals with tragedy and loss as a whole. Then there's Final Fantasy VII with all its epic moments and cool mysteries. The one that I always look forward to first and has always lingered in my mind is the battle for Sector 7's pillar control. I love the sense of adrenaline this game makes you feel at this moment, desperately trying to save all of your comrades in Avalanche and the entire sector itself. And after seeing Wedge, Biggs, and Jesse get either killed or wounded, you fail. Followed by a last-ditch escape attempt was adrenaline mixed with the right amount of loss. And it's the first true tragedy of the game, the first of many. And then after Sector 7's platefall and your failure to stop it, you decide to infiltrate Shinra HQ. And what an amazing sequence. You know, this is the moment for me that the story really started to gain steam in the game. And so what do you got? So you got, you know, the introduction of the headless horror known as Genova. You know, and eventually you are captured within the building, and then you are mysteriously released from your cells. And all of a sudden you're navigating Shinra's, you know, bloodied hallways. There's bodies everywhere. Even when you initiate combat, there's blood on the floor. Just an incredible sense of foreboding. And the musical theme that accompanies it is awesome, you know, especially after you see that Genova has broken out of its container. So you follow the blood all the way to the top of Shinra HQ and you find the president impaled at his desk with Sephiroth's sword in his back. And then, you know, we're quickly introduced to Rufus as well, you know, the new president. The king is dead, long live the king. And then we get the amazing escape sequence, you know, an awesome FMV sequence, followed by a cool mini game. And this leads to the end of the Midgar section of the game. And they do it in epic fashion. The infiltration of Shinra HQ was a great combination of subterfuge, horror, dramatic revelations, and action. It was and still is one of my favorite sequences in gaming, and one of my favorite parts of Final Fantasy VII. And then when we are finally out of Midgar, we get so many more epic sequences. You know, we're chasing Sephiroth across the world, and we're constantly fighting Genova. And, you know, at the time I thought we were chasing Sephiroth. You know, I should have figured it was Genova because Genova pieces are popping up wherever there's Sephiroth. Should have figured that's who we were chasing. But, you know, the Genova theme that accompanies the Genova fight is great. It always makes you feel like you're fighting an alien monstrosity. Just an awesome battle theme, one of the best. And then after we're, you know, done chasing Sephiroth across the world, we have the whole sequence at the Northern Crater where we give up the black materia and all the weapons are summoned. And then we figure out, or we find out, that Meteor's been summoned as well. And we get our first look at it in Junin after Cloud goes missing. Just so many epic sequences in this game. If I thought I had a good grasp on the situation, I was sure as heck wrong, because suddenly we had all these terrifying but cool new problems to deal with. And the moments right after discovering Meteor's been summoned in Junin are some of the most epic for me in the entire game. Sapphire Weapons attack on Junin was a sequence to this day that is burned in my memory, and I would just reload the attack sequence on Junin over and over again. I just loved seeing Shinra fight with everything it had against this, you know, this monstrosity that was concocted by the planet. You know, they're firing cannon after cannon, rocket launchers, and they're able to finally down it with the Sister Ray. Just an epic, awesomely done sequence. And it's all topped off with a slap fight on top of the Sister Ray after, you know, Tifa's able to avoid execution. So Tifa throws down with Scarlet in this epic slap fight. And I can't help but think, you know, Tifa is a certified badass. You know, an incredible martial artist, probably one of the best in Final Fantasy VII's world, you know, as far as we know. And man alive, she could just work Scarlet to the bone if she wanted to. As funny as the slap fight was, I almost wish she just, you know, kicked Scarlet's ass across the Sister Ray. Very much like Jackie Chan did that one guy in Rumble in the Bronx when he's fighting in the market and he kicks that clown across the grocery counter. That would have been a very fitting end, I feel, for Scarlet. And we're not even done yet with epic moments. We have the sequence at Rocket Town where Sid is finally able to go to space in Shinra's attempt to destroy Meteor with giant materia. And within this sequence, we learn that, Sid has been mistaken, and Shara is not as much to blame for Sid's failed attempt at going into space as he believed her to be. She actually saved Sid's life by staying, and working to the last minute. As awful it was for Sid, not to be able to go in space, this woman did save his life. And the guy felt like a piece of shit for how awful he'd been treating her all these years. And in compilation content, we know they get married because he's got some making up to do. So, I'm glad that was a full circle moment as well. And then after that, we have Diamond Weapon attacking Midgar, Rufus being blasted in Shinra HQ. And then we have the triumphant return to Midgar, destroying Shinra once and for all. And I gotta give props to Rufus. He stared down that Diamond Weapon attack to the bitter end. Didn't try to run, didn't try to hide, just stood there and took it. And it was a badass exit for a cool villain. And along with all of these epic moments, Final Fantasy VII had a great flair for a good mystery and dramatic revelations. The biggest one for myself personally was Tifa's descent into Cloud's troubled mind after the earthquake at Mideel. So up until this point in time, the player doesn't really know what to make of Cloud. We're getting conflicting statements. Yes, Tifa had a childhood friend named Cloud, but we're also getting statements that he was created piece by piece in a lab from Sephiroth. And that, he was a failed experiment by Hojo. So right away, we're like, okay, there's a lot going on here. And then Tifa says, Cloud, things you shouldn't know, and the things you should know, you don't know. So as the player, we're very confused. We have no idea what his deal is, truly. But this mind dive clears everything up, and the result and everything we learn in it is mind-blowing. So the biggest reveal, narratively speaking, from this mind dive sequence, I believe, is that Cloud in previous flashbacks was front and center with Sephiroth. He had visited his mother, he did all this stuff. He talked with Tifa. But in these flashbacks before, there was also, a random Shinra grunt that was in all these key scenes as well, that we didn't really know much about. Well, it turns out Cloud was this Shinra grunt the whole time, and the character he thought he was in these memories was actually Zack. So that was the big takeaway, which was mind-blowing. Didn't see it coming one bit. And the icing on the cake is, Sephiroth, he kills Tifa's father, he kills Cloud's mom, he kills the whole town. And, he beats Zack as well, right after he, mortally wounds, or at least, critically wounds Tifa. But Cloud regains consciousness and follows him up to the Nibelheim reactor where Jenova is. And he is able to wound Sephiroth and go back and take care of Tifa. Keeping the childhood promise that he would return and protect her if she ever needed him to. And then obviously we get Sephiroth, wounded, making his way out with Genova's head. And then Cloud, and this is the part that really gets me and just, makes me love this sequence. Cloud, the lowly grunt, the guy who couldn't make the cut with Soldier, fights Sephiroth. He's impaled on Sephiroth's sword, but he doesn't let it stop him. And he ends up throwing Sephiroth off the damn bridge into the, the Mako below. How poetic is that? The guy who couldn't cut it, that was too embarrassed to show his face in town, just rocked the number one guy in the world's ass. So that was the big takeaway from this. But the thing that really got to me this time was just the kind of kid Cloud was. He was small, he was insecure, and more than anything, he wanted Tifa, the girl next door, to notice him. He very much convinced himself he didn't want to be friends with Tifa's friends. They were all dumb, but deep down, he knew he was the one that was being dumb. He knew he was being stupid. He just wanted to fit in. He wanted the beautiful girl next door to notice him. And if Tifa was the girl living next door to you, you'd want her to notice you too. I would. So that just made him so sympathetic to me this time around, because we've all had those moments where we want someone to notice us or we've had zero confidence. And I just loved that sequence, and it made him super endearing to me. speaking of crushes and such, I should touch on this game's romantic subplot a little bit. I was shocked when Aerith was removed from the equation, because very much so I got the impression that Aerith was meant to be the main love interest, right? And that Tifa was very secondary, it just wasn't going to happen. So all of a sudden when Tifa is thrust into the spotlight and her and Cloud's relationship starts developing more, it was something very unexpected, but very welcome, because in my opinion, Tifa's the best girl anyway. So, that was another layer to this game that I wasn't anticipating and, was a pleasant surprise. And especially given the fact with how hesitant Tifa is about her feelings and talking to Cloud about them. By the end of the game, if you date her properly, she is, she's very forward. And then you have that whole sequence under the high wind, where everyone's gone their separate ways before the final battles. Her and Cloud are talking. And if you play your cards right, during the conversation, she essentially tells Cloud, after Cloud can't find the words to say to her, essentially words aren't the only way to show or, tell someone how you feel. And then Cloud stops and he looks at her and it fades to black. And I remember seeing that the first time and I was just like, did I read that correctly? Like, is what I think about to happen happening? And pretty much it does, right? So I just thought that was a beautiful touch. I loved that development for their relationship. Thought it was great. And the development was incredibly satisfying. There's nothing more unsatisfying than seeing a relationship go absolutely nowhere. And then we have the game's conclusion itself, the descent into the northern crater to finally face Sephiroth. And 3 of the game's best battle themes are in this single sequence, and they are all awesome. And while a lot of final boss themes are good, having 3 of them back to back at the very end of the game is almost criminal, since we only get to hear them once at the very end. First, there's Genova Absolute, which is awesome and kicks things off with a bang. Bizarro Sephiroth is cool as hell too. And then we get the absolutely iconic Safer Sephiroth theme. Within this final dungeon, you can send party members down different paths. All the enemies are incredibly strong. The music fits wonderfully as well. And the whole party being together, charging Sephiroth at once after creating 3 separate parties, ensuring that if you need everybody to fight, they can. Making it truly an epic final sequence worthy of this game. And then after you defeat Safer Sephiroth and you're about to make your way out of the crater, Cloud gets a final one-on-one confrontation with Sephiroth. And he rocks Sephiroth to his core. He leaves no doubt in terms of who the number 1 guy is. And it's so satisfying seeing the culmination of all of Cloud's growth and the strength he has come to possess in this moment, making it a great final send-off for these two's conflict. And after this conflict is resolved, we get to see one of the best concluding sequences to a game ever. Holy is released, we get the epic sequence of the high wind transforming, and then Holy finally reaches its destination of Midgar, where Meteor is causing a ton of destruction, and it's not working. But, in the final moments, the planet decides to show up. The children in Calm, Marlene being one of them, is watching it slowly approach, and that music starts playing. That end sequence with that music is one of the best of all time, and it just makes me swell with emotion every time I hear it. But I do have one complaint with Final Fantasy VII's ending. While it was, captivating and enthralling and emotionally engaging, I absolutely hate the 500 year later bullshit. I hated it then, I hate it now, because I wanted to see what happened with everybody. I cared about all these characters. I wanted to know, where they ended up, and I wanted to see, what happened to Midgar. I wanted to see what happened to Meteor, to Holy, to the planet, everything. And then obviously we get, Red 13 and his two pups making it up to the very top, and we see we see Midgar, totally overgrown, right? And then, it kind of fades to black, and then we hear children laughing, letting it be known that humans likely survived because it was the planet's choice whether we got to, essentially keep on existing or not. So I always had that as the takeaway that, humanity did carry on. And I could at the very least, carry on with the thought that I could just assume everything turned out for the best. I could assume everyone turned out okay and everyone was happy. Right? But I just still really hate that 500 year later garbage. I really do. I'm not a fan of it. So, I feel like I've done the game justice. I could talk about so many aspects, more, like the music, for example. I could talk about, the bombing run theme, the Icicle Inn theme, the destruction of Shinra theme. I could be here all day just talking about the music in this game. But suffice to say, along with the story, gameplay, mechanics, characters, music was just as awesome in this game too. So suffice to say, this game rocks, and it'll always rock. And we are currently in the process of getting the Final Fantasy VII remake series. Part 1's out, and who knows how many more parts it'll be. But chances are this remake venture for Final Fantasy VII right now probably won't be the last, and we might get another remake 20, 30, 40 years down the road, because this game is that good and has that many fans, and it is embedded itself in popular culture forever. So no, Final Fantasy VII, this is my tribute review for it. It is one of the greatest games of all time, and it will always be near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure to a lot of yours as well. Anyway, thank you for joining me for this Game Break, guys. I'll see you next time.